The day began with the ordinary rhythm of a bustling airport, yet hidden in its noise was the kind of moment that would transform ordinary into unforgettable. John F. Kennedy International Airport was alive with its usual choreography, families clustered together balancing too many bags, business travelers briskly weaving through crowds with their eyes glued to phones, children pointing at airplanes parked like metallic birds outside the massive windows. The sun was rising, spilling its first rays over the tarmac, casting long golden lines across the sleek silver fuselage of Flight 782, a direct route to Los Angeles. For most, it was just another flight. For one man seated quietly in first class, it would become the stage of humiliation, revelation, and justice. That man was Marcus Ellington. At 42, he carried himself with the polished dignity of someone accustomed to responsibility. His navy blue tailored suit clung to his frame with precision, his tie knotted perfectly, his leather shoes reflecting a faint shine. On his wrist glinted a classic Omega watch, understated yet commanding. Beneath his seat rested a slim black leather briefcase, its surface smooth, its corners reinforced with brass, and engraved near the clasp were the initials M.E., symbols of ownership, but also of identity carved through years of struggle. Marcus wasn't just a wealthy passenger. He was the majority shareholder of the very airline operating Flight 782. It was an irony only fate could script. Today, he would be mistaken not as an owner, not as a leader, but as a trespasser. As passengers trickled into the cabin, the mood was one of quiet anticipation. The wide leather seats gleamed under overhead lights, pillows placed just so, fresh linen folded, champagne glasses waiting to be filled. A businessman in seat 3C already had his laptop open, spreadsheets glowing across the screen. A young woman in 2B wore oversized sunglasses, scrolling through her phone with manicured nails. A couple in 1A whispered excitedly about their vacation plans. And then there was Marcus, sitting tall in 2A, gazing out the oval window as the sun's reflection spread across the wing. He adjusted his cufflinks, exhaled slowly, and thought of his wife's words from years ago. You walk into a room, and people see your skin before they see your suit. She had been right, again and again. It was then that Kelly, the flight attendant assigned to first class, made her entrance. Her uniform was impeccable, pressed so stiffly it seemed immune to wrinkles. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it sharpened her features into something severe. She walked with authority, tray tucked against her arm, offering polite greetings to passengers she clearly considered her equals. When her eyes fell on Marcus, however, something changed. Surprise flickered for half a second, followed by suspicion, then hardened into something Marcus knew well: disbelief, coated in courtesy. She approached his seat, leaned slightly, and said in a voice that carried just enough for surrounding passengers to hear, "Sir, I think you may have taken the wrong seat. Business class is behind the curtain." The words cracked like a whip in the hushed luxury of the cabin. The businessman in 3C looked up, smirking faintly. The young woman in 2B froze mid-scroll, lowering her phone as though waiting for the outcome. Marcus turned his head, meeting Kelly's eyes with calm steadiness. "This is my seat," he replied evenly. 2A, first class. He reached into his pocket, producing his boarding pass with practiced ease, and held it out for her inspection. Kelly glanced at the pass, barely enough to register its authenticity, before shaking her head. "These seats are reserved for our priority customers," she said. "Executives, members, you understand." Her emphasis on "you" dripped with meaning. Marcus inhaled, patient but firm. "And what exactly makes you so certain I don't belong here?" The flight attendant's professional smile faltered, replaced by irritation. "Sir, I don't want to make a scene before takeoff. Please, return to your assigned class." She gestured toward the curtain, her tone sharp. Marcus placed the boarding pass squarely on her tray. "My assigned class," he said quietly, "is right here, whether you like it or not." Silence spread through the cabin like spilled ink. Passengers leaned subtly into the tension, their curiosity sharpened. A college student in row 4 whispered, "Damn!" under his breath, while another passenger discreetly lifted a phone, its red light glowing faintly as recording began. Kelly's cheeks flushed, but instead of admitting her error, she pressed forward. "Very well," she snapped, "but don't expect special treatment. Drinks are for our regulars, not... Well." She let the sentence hang, her meaning unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The businessman in 3C chuckled under his breath. The couple in 1A exchanged glances, discomfort etched across their faces. The young woman in 2B shifted in her seat, clearly unsettled. Marcus leaned back slowly, folding his hands in his lap, his jaw tightening. His expression remained calm, but within him churned memories of boardrooms where his proposals were ignored until echoed by white colleagues, restaurants where waiters forgot his table, streets where patrol cars slowed just enough to send a message. He had thought he was immune by now, armored by success, insulated by wealth. But prejudice had a way of seeping through armor, striking the soul in moments least expected. Still, Marcus was not a man who reacted with anger. He was a man who strategized, who calculated, who understood the value of timing. He studied Kelly, memorizing every word, every gesture. He studied the passengers, noting their reactions, their discomfort, their complicity. And as humiliation pressed against him like heavy air, he reminded himself, this is evidence. Evidence of a culture that saw his presence as anomaly, his success as unearned, his dignity as negotiable. The cabin's luxury now felt poisoned. Trays clinked as other passengers received their drinks. Champagne fizzed in crystal glasses. The aroma of roasted chicken and saffron rice floated through the air. Yet Marcus's table remained empty, his space deliberately void of acknowledgement. Kelly swept past him again, her eyes sliding away as though he were invisible. This, too, was part of the humiliation, not only to be insulted, but to be erased. The businessman in 3C raised his glass toward Marcus mockingly, murmuring, "Guess some people just don't make the cut." Marcus turned his gaze back to the window, catching his own reflection. A black man in a navy suit, seated in first class, treated as an interloper. He exhaled slowly, willing himself to patience. For he knew something no one else did. When the moment came, when the truth was revealed, the silence of this cabin would erupt into something unforgettable. "Sir," Kelly said sharply, returning with her cart, "I'll ask you again not to disrupt the comfort of our regular passengers." Marcus tilted his head, his eyes meeting hers without flinching. "And I'll remind you again," he said quietly, "I am exactly where I belong." The words lingered in the air like thunder waiting to crack. Passengers shifted in their seats, sensing they were witnesses to more than a quarrel. They were witnessing history in microcosm, the clash between prejudice and dignity, between assumption and truth. As the plane prepared for taxi, the captain's voice echoed through the speakers, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 782. We'll be departing shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for takeoff." The announcement momentarily diffused the tension, but the undercurrent remained. Marcus sat unmoving, his hands resting on his briefcase, feeling its weight not just as an object, but as a symbol. Within it lay documents, contracts, and one particular set of papers that bore his name as majority shareholder of the airline. The irony was sharp. Here he was, owning what others believed he did not deserve to access. Kelly continued down the aisle, plastering her professional smile onto interactions with others. She poured champagne, offered warm towels, and bent with rehearsed grace toward passengers she deemed worthy. Yet every time she passed Marcus, she stiffened, as though his very presence unsettled the script she lived by. Her eyes flicked toward him occasionally, narrowing, calculating, but never softening. Marcus remained patient. He knew timing was everything. The humiliation he endured now was fuel for what would come. And though his silence might appear as defeat, it was the silence of strategy, of preparation, of justice biding its time. He thought of his father, a man who had once told him, "Son, dignity isn't what they give you. It's what you refuse to let them take." Those words anchored him now. Across the cabin, passengers whispered, some sympathetic, others amused. A young man leaned toward his neighbor and muttered, "She's out of line." Another shrugged. "Maybe he did sneak up here." The spectrum of assumptions played out like a mirror of society itself, beliefs bending toward prejudice, truths obscured by doubt. Marcus's eyes shifted to the briefcase under his seat. The initials M.E. glimmered faintly in the low light. In that briefcase was more than paperwork. It was power. And when the time came, he would wield it not as a shield, but as a sword. For now, he waited, composed, watching humiliation attempt to etch itself into his dignity, and failing. The engines roared louder as the plane prepared for its ascent. Passengers buckled their seatbelts, conversations hushed, and the cabin tilted back as Flight 782 lifted into the sky. Outside, clouds rolled by like soft battlegrounds, the horizon stretching endless and bright. Inside, the real battle had already begun, silent but fierce, a confrontation that was only just unfolding. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, drawing in a breath of steady calm. When he opened them again, his reflection stared back from the window, patient, poised, unyielding. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. The engines of Flight 782 had settled into a steady rhythm as the plane cut through the morning sky, climbing above the clouds where the horizon stretched like an endless ocean of white. The first-class cabin, designed for serenity, hummed with small sounds, the clinking of cutlery, the rustle of newspapers, the soft clicks of laptop keys. It should have been tranquil, a sanctuary of comfort. But for Marcus Ellington, seated in 2A, serenity had evaporated the moment flight attendant Kelly decided to mark him as an intruder. Now, the real sting began. Not from her words alone, but from what followed. The deliberate erasure of dignity, enacted with precision and cruelty, hidden beneath the thin veil of service. Meal service was a ritual in first class, conducted with pomp that bordered on theatrical. White linen napkins were draped with ceremony, silver trays gleamed, and wine was poured with the grace of a stage performance. Marcus had flown countless times before, had seen attendants balance trays with ballet-like precision. But this morning, he saw that same ritual twisted into an act of exclusion. Kelly began her service with the couple in 1A, bowing slightly as she presented a bottle of champagne. "Would you care for a top-off before your meal?" she asked sweetly. The couple smiled, glasses raised, the bubbles fizzing golden in the sunlight. She moved on, offering menus, explaining entrees. She lingered at each seat, her tone polite, her demeanor gracious. But when she reached Marcus, she paused just long enough to be insulting, then shifted the cart away without a word, her eyes sliding past him as though he were invisible. Marcus cleared his throat politely. "Excuse me, I believe you skipped me." His tone was measured, patient. Kelly didn't stop rolling the cart. She looked over her shoulder, lips pressing into a tight line. "We've run out of your selection, sir." The lie was obvious. The selections hadn't even been offered yet. Around him, passengers stiffened. A few looked away, unwilling to witness, but others leaned in. The businessman in 3C smirked openly, whispering something under his breath to the passenger beside him. The young woman in 2B froze, her face tight with discomfort. "I didn't have a chance to choose," Marcus replied evenly. Kelly exhaled sharply, annoyance etched across her face. "Priority customers are served first. We'll see what's left after." Her words fell like blows, each syllable soaked in dismissal. A man in row 4 muttered softly, "Damn, that's cold." Another passenger tilted his phone, the red recording light faint but unmistakable. The humiliation was being documented, whether Kelly realized it or not. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his posture regal even as the heat of shame burned beneath his skin. He folded his hands over his lap, refusing to let anger dictate his next move. Inside, though, the weight pressed heavy. Memories of dinners where waiters had bypassed him, meetings where his voice was ignored until echoed by someone else. Subtle reminders that no matter his wealth, his suit, his watch, some people would always see only his skin. This wasn't just an insult. It was a performance, designed to remind him of his place. The humiliation deepened with every course. Plates of roasted chicken, saffron rice, and seared salmon drifted down the aisle, landing gracefully on tray tables. Crystal glasses were filled with champagne, wine, or sparkling water. Marcus's tray table remained empty, folded up like a symbol of denial. Kelly moved with precision, stopping to ask passengers how their meals were. She leaned toward the businessman in 3C, laughing at his joke. She fussed over the young woman in 2B, offering her an extra bread roll. But when her eyes skimmed over Marcus, they hardened, her lips twitching into a faint smirk before she turned away. It was deliberate, calculated. She wanted the other passengers to see. She wanted Marcus to know. One man, emboldened by the atmosphere, leaned slightly across the aisle. "Guess they didn't have your meal, huh?" His tone dripped with mockery. Marcus didn't answer. He kept his eyes fixed forward, his composure unbroken. Yet the silence itself became part of the humiliation, as though his dignity had been stripped and placed on display for everyone to interpret as they wished. The young woman in 2B finally spoke, her voice low. "Excuse me," she said to Kelly. "Aren't you forgetting him?" Kelly's smile tightened. "We're following policy, ma'am. Thank you for your concern." The young woman shrank back, lips pressed into silence. Marcus turned slightly, offering her a faint nod of gratitude. His voice was calm when he finally spoke again, directed at Kelly. "Policy, you say? Interesting. I'd very much like to see that policy in writing when we land." Kelly's cheeks flushed crimson. "Sir, I suggest you don't make this difficult. We are trained to handle disruptions." Her tone carried the implicit threat. Everyone heard it. A ripple of discomfort swept through the cabin. The businessman in 3C chuckled audibly, muttering, "Some people just don't learn." Marcus sat perfectly still, breathing evenly. Inside, however, he felt the burn of every gaze. He thought of his younger brother, once pulled over for a traffic violation that turned into a night in jail. He thought of his father, who had spent years teaching him how to endure slights without losing himself. He thought of his wife's words, echoing again. "They see your skin before your suit." Kelly returned moments later with a tray. For a brief second, Marcus thought she might relent. Instead, she leaned close, her voice low but sharp. "If you want to eat, sir, Coach is serving peanuts." The cruelty was surgical, delivered with precision. Passengers gasped audibly. The young woman in 2B whispered, "Oh my God." The man in 3C laughed out loud, shaking his head. Marcus exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stillness. He would not give her the satisfaction of reaction. He would endure, because endurance was not defeat. It was patience. And patience, he knew, was a weapon. Hours stretched into a distorted theater of exclusion. Marcus's stomach tightened with hunger, but hunger was nothing compared to the weight of humiliation pressing on him. He watched as coffee was poured, desserts served, trays cleared. His table remained bare, a deliberate void. The whispers grew louder. Passengers speculated quietly, their words carrying enough for him to hear. Maybe he sneaked into first class. Maybe his card didn't go through. Maybe he's causing trouble on purpose. Each theory stripped another layer of dignity, reducing him to rumor, to assumption. The power of perception had turned him from owner to outcast, from leader to suspect, all within the confines of a luxury cabin. Yet Marcus did not crumble. He sat tall, his posture unbroken, his silence heavy with meaning. His mind worked tirelessly, cataloguing every moment, every slight. He thought of his father's words. Dignity isn't what they give you. It's what you refuse to let them take. He repeated it like a mantra. Kelly passed by once more, her smirk widening as she caught his eye. "Still comfortable, sir?" she asked, her voice saccharine. Marcus met her gaze steadily. "Very," he said softly. The exchange was small, almost invisible, but it carried weight. For Marcus knew the truth. Humiliation could wound, but it could also reveal. And soon, the truth would be revealed. Not in whispers, not in rumors, but in undeniable proof. As the plane cruised above the clouds, Marcus stared out the window, his reflection gazing back at him. He saw not defeat, but preparation. This was not the end of his story. It was the turning point. The humiliation he endured now would become the foundation of justice later. And though no one else in that cabin knew it yet, the man they mocked, ignored, and dismissed was not just a passenger. He was the owner. And when the time came, their laughter would turn to silence, their whispers to shock, their complicity to shame. For now, though, Marcus endured, every insult etched into memory, every slight recorded in silence. Justice, he reminded himself, required patience, and patience was something he had mastered long ago. The airplane cruised smoothly above the clouds, engines droning in a steady rhythm that should have lulled passengers into comfort. Yet in the first-class cabin, comfort had fractured. The humiliation Marcus had endured in silence was no longer a private matter between him and flight attendant Kelly. It had become a spectacle, and spectacles attract whispers. It started small. Two men seated across the aisle leaned toward each other, voices lowered but still audible in the hush of the cabin. "What's his deal? Didn't even get served." The other chuckled under his breath. "Maybe he slipped up here by mistake. Happens sometimes." A woman in row 1 tilted her head back, whispering to her husband. "Do you think he actually belongs here? He doesn't look like the type." Her husband shrugged, taking a sip of champagne. "Not my problem, but she's right to be firm. Got to keep order up here." The words seeped into the air like smoke. Marcus heard them, of course he did. He heard everything. He sat perfectly still, his posture straight, his eyes fixed on the seat back in front of him, but his ears absorbed each syllable, each insinuation. His silence was a shield, but shields still absorbed blows. Kelly's smirk lingered as she swept down the aisle again. She stopped at 3C, crouched slightly, and whispered something to the businessman there. They both laughed softly, a conspiratorial sound that made Marcus's chest tighten. The businessman's voice carried back. "Yeah, figured as much. Some people always try to push where they don't belong." The young woman in 2B, who had spoken up earlier, sat stiffly, her hands clasped around her phone. She didn't speak again, but her eyes darted between Marcus and the others, her discomfort growing by the second. She was witnessing a trial by whispers, and she knew it. For Marcus, the whispers were worse than Kelly's words. Kelly's prejudice was overt, sharp, easy to identify. But the whispers, they were the true rot. They spread quietly, corroding perception, transforming an innocent man into a suspect in the eyes of strangers. He thought of his father's lessons, the way he had warned him. They won't always shout it, son. Sometimes it's the whispers that do the most damage. The whispers multiplied. A group of 3 passengers in row 4 leaned together, their voices hushed but intense. "Did you see how she skipped him?" One asked. "Maybe there's a reason." Another replied, "Or maybe she knows something we don't." The third, a younger man with restless energy, grinned. "Bet he snuck in here. Watch, he'll get thrown back before we land." Their quiet laughter carried down the aisle, small but cutting. A middle-aged woman in 5A, clearly emboldened, leaned forward toward the couple in 1A. "Excuse me, do you know if that man actually belongs here?" she whispered. The wife shook her head quickly. "I don't think so. Did you see how she spoke to him? She wouldn't do that if he was one of us. One of us. The phrase struck Marcus like a lash. He didn't flinch outwardly, but inside, he felt the sting. He was being stripped of belonging in real time, not by rules, not by facts, but by perception. A collective decision formed in the shadows of whispered voices. Kelly returned, her tray rattling faintly as turbulence nudged the plane. She steadied herself, then stopped again near 3C. Her voice was low, but Marcus heard it. "Don't worry, he won't be a problem." The reassurance sent another ripple through the cabin. The whispers thickened, feeding on themselves. Passengers who had once been neutral now tilted toward suspicion. A man muttered, "Maybe he has a fake ticket." Another added, "Security should have checked him better." The phone cameras recorded quietly, capturing not only images, but atmosphere. The subtle tilts of heads, the suppressed chuckles, the side glances, all part of a theater Marcus had not agreed to perform in, yet had been cast as the lead. Marcus's silence remained, but it was no longer just strategy. It was defiance. For every whisper that sought to erase him, his composure shouted louder. He sat with dignity intact, refusing to yield, even as the tide of perception threatened to drown him. The whispers soon became so thick they felt like a second language in the cabin. Every movement Marcus made, adjusting his cufflinks, reaching for his briefcase, leaning back in his chair, was interpreted, reframed, and passed along. "Did you see that? He's nervous. He keeps touching that bag. Suspicious. Probably hiding something." A passenger finally voiced what many were thinking. "Should we tell the captain?" he whispered to his neighbor. The neighbor shrugged, but his hesitation was answer enough. Fear had entered the whispers now, not just prejudice, and fear was combustible. Kelly thrived on it. Her posture straightened, her smirk deepened. She had managed not only to humiliate Marcus, but to recruit the cabin into her narrative. She no longer needed to speak. The passengers were doing it for her. Marcus stared out the window, the clouds drifting below like endless fields of cotton. His reflection gazed back, strong but weary. He thought of his wife and children, of the future he was building not just for himself, but for them. He thought of his company, of the employees who looked up to him, of the responsibilities he carried. And he thought of how, in this moment, none of it mattered to those around him. To them, he was a whisper, a doubt, a trespasser. He exhaled slowly, centering himself. The whispers couldn't define him. They could wound, yes, but they couldn't strip him of what he knew to be true. And soon, the truth would silence every last one of them. But for now, he endured, letting the whispers swirl, letting them build to a crescendo. For justice, he knew, often came only after the noise. The whispers had built into a suffocating storm, wrapping around Marcus like invisible chains. Every movement he made was judged, reinterpreted, spread down the rows of first-class passengers. He had endured humiliation, endured whispers, endured the cold precision of Kelly's prejudice. But endurance was not infinite. It was strategy. He had waited, bided his time, allowed the stage to set itself. Now, the moment had come. The airplane had leveled at cruising altitude, the cabin lights softened to a golden glow, and trays of half-eaten meals lingered before satisfied passengers. Except one tray, folded, empty, in front of Marcus. His table remained bare, a void that spoke louder than words. He placed his hand on the leather briefcase at his feet, feeling the weight of it. Not just the physical weight of documents and contracts, but the symbolic weight of power contained within. For 15 years he had built himself from the ground up, brick by brick, decision by decision, sacrifice by sacrifice. He had sat in boardrooms where people underestimated him, negotiated deals where his presence was doubted, and yet he had risen. And now the airline itself bore his signature. He drew in a slow breath, exhaled, and then, without drama, without haste, he unbuckled his seatbelt. The metallic click was louder than it should have been in the hushed cabin. Passengers glanced up. Kelly, 2 rows ahead, stiffened and turned, irritation flickering across her face. Marcus stood. His presence filled the narrow aisle, tall and commanding, the navy suit catching the dim light. He bent slightly, lifted the briefcase, and set it gently on the folded table before him. Gasps rippled. The whispers grew louder. What's he doing? Why is he standing up? Maybe he's going to cause trouble. Kelly hurried down the aisle, her heels clicking against the carpet. Sir, I'll need you to remain seated. It's against FAA regulations to stand at this time. Her voice was sharp, clipped. Marcus met her eyes with a calm so profound it silenced the nearest whispers. What's against regulation? He said evenly. Is the treatment I've received since boarding this flight. The businessman in 3C chuckled loudly. Here we go, he muttered. Marcus ignored him. He placed the briefcase flat, released the brass clasps with a soft snap, and opened it. Inside, neatly organized, were documents, contracts, financial statements, and a leather-bound folder stamped with the embossed logo of the airline. The gold glimmer caught the light. Unmistakable. Kelly froze, her voice faltering. What is that? Marcus lifted the folder, holding it firmly for all to see. His voice carried through the cabin, calm, but resonant. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe introductions are in order. My name is Marcus Ellington, and as of last month, I am the majority shareholder of this airline. The words detonated like thunder. Gasps erupted. Phones lifted higher, recording openly now. Passengers leaned forward, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. Kelly's mouth opened, closed, opened again like a fish gasping for air. The silence that followed was absolute, then shattered by the voice of the young woman in 2B. Wait, you own the airline? Her tone carried disbelief, but also awe. Marcus inclined his head. Correct. This airline is under my leadership, and every person wearing this uniform answers ultimately to me. The businessman in 3C sputtered, his smirk collapsing into something ugly. That's impossible. You're lying. This is ridiculous. Marcus turned toward him, his gaze steady. I don't need your belief to validate the truth. The documents speak for themselves. He laid the folder open on the tray, revealing official seals, signatures, and the unmistakable letterhead of corporate ownership. Passengers craned their necks, their whispers transforming instantly from suspicion to astonishment. Oh my God, he's serious. Look at those seals. I can't believe it. Kelly's hands trembled as she reached instinctively for the folder, then froze mid-motion. She knew touching it would only confirm his authority. Her voice quivered. You can't just stand here and... What I can do, Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting cleanly through the air, is remind you of the responsibility you hold when wearing that uniform. You are entrusted to serve, to uphold dignity, to treat every passenger with respect. And yet, you chose to humiliate me, to strip away basic courtesy, to incite whispers and suspicion. Kelly's face burned crimson, but she tried to recover. Sir, I was only following protocol. Marcus raised a hand, silencing her. Do not insult this cabin further by hiding behind protocol. There is no protocol that allows prejudice. There is no policy that justifies humiliation. What you displayed today was not regulation. It was bias. Applause broke out, tentative at first, then swelling. The young woman in 2B clapped, her face lit with fierce approval. The couple in 1A joined, hesitant but resolute. Even passengers from the rows behind leaned forward, applauding softly. The whispers had changed. The tide had turned. Kelly looked around, eyes wide, realizing the cabin was no longer hers to command. Marcus straightened, his presence commanding, his voice unwavering. This humiliation was deliberate, and I allowed it to unfold because sometimes silence is necessary to reveal the truth. But let me be clear. Dignity is not granted by uniforms, by titles, or by seats on an aircraft. Dignity is inherent, and you, Ms. Kelly, failed to recognize it. The flight attendant's knees buckled slightly. Her voice came out as a whisper. I didn't know. Marcus's reply was sharp. That's the point. You didn't want to know. The captain emerged from the cockpit, alerted by the growing commotion. His expression was puzzled, then concerned as he took in the scene. Passengers clapping, Kelly pale and trembling, Marcus standing tall with documents spread before him. What's going on here? The captain demanded. Marcus turned toward him, extending the folder. Captain, my name is Marcus Ellington. I am the owner of this airline. What you're witnessing is not a disruption caused by me. It's the exposure of discrimination by your crew. The captain blinked, stunned. He scanned the documents quickly, recognizing the seals, the signatures. His face shifted from confusion to shock, then to shame. He looked at Kelly. Is this true? Kelly stammered. I didn't know who he was. The captain's voice hardened. You didn't need to know who he was. Every passenger deserves respect. Every passenger deserves service. You've disgraced this crew. Kelly's eyes filled with tears, her composure fracturing. She tried to speak, but no words came. Marcus closed the folder gently, sliding it back into his briefcase. His voice was calm, but it carried the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime wielding it. This cabin witnessed everything, and it will not be forgotten. Not by me, not by the passengers, and certainly not by the board when I review this incident. The applause rose again, louder this time. Some passengers even stood briefly, clapping with conviction. Phones captured every angle, every word. The truth was undeniable, immortalized on video, destined to spread beyond the walls of the aircraft. Marcus looked around the cabin one final time. Let today be a reminder, he said. Prejudice thrives in silence, in whispers, in unchecked assumptions. But when the truth is revealed, when dignity stands its ground, prejudice collapses under its own weight. Remember that. The cabin erupted into applause once more. Kelly slumped into a seat, her face buried in her hands. The captain nodded solemnly at Marcus, acknowledging both his authority and his dignity. Marcus sat back down, rebuckled his seatbelt, and gazed out the window. The clouds drifted past, serene and endless. His reflection stared back, steady and unyielding. The reveal had come. The humiliation had been reversed. Justice had begun. The cabin was electric. The reveal had detonated like lightning, and its thunder still rolled through every corner of first class. Passengers sat stunned, champagne glasses trembling in their hands, phones raised like glowing eyes capturing every second. The smirks, the whispers, the mocking laughter, all of it had collapsed into silence and awe. Marcus Ellington had shifted in their eyes from an unwelcome outsider to a man whose authority eclipsed everyone in uniform. Kelly sat rigid, her back pressed against the galley wall, her hands twisting together in her lap. Her face had lost its practiced confidence. It was pale, her eyes wide and wet. She seemed to shrink in on herself as though wishing the floor would open beneath her. The captain lingered near the cockpit door, documents still in his hand, his expression dark with recognition of the truth. The other flight attendants avoided eye contact, suddenly hyper-aware of the weight of their roles, of the thin line between professionalism and complicity. The first-class passengers were no longer whispering about Marcus. Now, they whispered about her. Did you see how she treated him? This is going to be all over the news. Unbelievable, she picked the wrong man. Their voices no longer carried derision, but judgment aimed squarely at Kelly. Marcus remained seated, his posture calm, his composure unbroken. Yet the cabin felt different now. It wasn't tension pressing on him. It was the release of it, the shift of power. He had taken the wound of humiliation and turned it into a sword, and now the cabin sat in its shadow. The young woman in 2B leaned toward him cautiously. "Mr. Ellington," she whispered, her voice low but reverent, "I just want to say, I'm sorry for what you went through before. I didn't know." Marcus turned, his eyes softening slightly. "You don't need to apologize," he said quietly. "You saw what was wrong. That's what matters." Her shoulders relaxed, and she nodded. The weight of complicity had been heavy on her, but his words gave her reprieve. The captain cleared his throat, stepping closer to Marcus. "Mr. Ellington," he began carefully, "I assure you this incident will be reported to headquarters. The behavior you experienced does not reflect the values of this airline." Marcus's reply was calm, but edged with steel. "Captain, I am headquarters, and values are not just words on a pamphlet. They are actions repeated daily in every uniform and every interaction. What happened here reflects something deeper, and it must be addressed." The captain's jaw tightened. He nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of what had been said. "Yes, sir. Understood." Kelly finally found her voice, though it trembled. "Mr. Ellington, please. I didn't know who you were." Marcus's gaze was steady. "You didn't need to know who I was. You only needed to know I was a human being deserving of dignity, and you failed that test." Her lips parted as though to argue, but no words came. Tears slipped down her cheeks. The passengers watched silently, their phones still recording, their judgment now a collective weight she couldn't escape. The businessman in 3C, who had laughed at Marcus earlier, suddenly shifted in his seat, his smirk gone. He tugged at his collar nervously, realizing how damning his laughter might look when those videos went public. He leaned toward Marcus hesitantly. "Mr. Ellington, I didn't realize—" Marcus cut him off with a glance. "No, you realized exactly what you were doing. You just didn't think there'd be consequences." The words landed heavy, final. The businessman sat back, color draining from his face. Passengers around the cabin began murmuring, but the tone had changed. It wasn't whispers of suspicion anymore. It was judgment, accountability, even admiration. The tide had turned completely. As the hours wore on and the plane cut steadily across the sky, the atmosphere in first class transformed. Where humiliation had once lingered, there was now reverence. Marcus had become a symbol in that cabin, of dignity, of power, of justice revealed. Every glance toward him carried respect, some tinged with guilt, others with awe. Kelly remained in the galley, unable to face the passengers she had performed her cruelty before. The other attendants tiptoed around her, torn between sympathy and disapproval. The captain stayed mostly in the cockpit, his pride dented by the knowledge that a passenger, no, the airline's owner, had witnessed the failure of his crew. Marcus, however, did not gloat. He did not revel in her collapse. He sat quietly, gazing out the window at the clouds below. His dignity was not in breaking her, but in refusing to be broken himself. At one point, the young woman in 2B leaned over again. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" she asked, softly. Marcus's lips curved into a faint smile. "Sometimes the truth needs a stage. If I had spoken earlier, it would have been my word against hers. But by waiting, I let the performance play out. And the truth revealed itself." She nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. As the plane began its descent hours later, Marcus finally reached down, closed his briefcase, and fastened the clasps. The sound echoed like a gavel falling, a symbolic end to the trial that had unfolded in the sky. The passengers sat straighter, waiting for his final words. He stood, adjusting his suit, and addressed them calmly. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you witnessed today was not just about me. It was about how quickly we judge, how easily we whisper, how casually we allow prejudice to breathe. But let me tell you this, prejudice survives on silence, and silence ends when truth stands tall." Applause erupted, louder than before, longer, resonating through the cabin like thunder. Phones recorded, hearts raced, and for once, justice felt visible, tangible, undeniable. Marcus sat back down, buckled his seatbelt, and let the applause wash over him. Outside, the city lights of Los Angeles twinkled into view. Inside, dignity had triumphed. The aftermath was not defeat. It was transformation. The wheels touched down on the Los Angeles runway with a jolt that rippled through the cabin. But the passengers of Flight 782 barely noticed. Their attention wasn't on the landing. It was still on Marcus Ellington, the man who had turned humiliation into revelation, whispers into applause. The cabin lights brightened as the plane taxied toward its gate. The young woman in 2B glanced at Marcus with something bordering on reverence. The businessman in 3C sat slumped, eyes lowered, a man convicted by silence. Kelly remained frozen in the galley, her hands trembling, her cheeks still streaked with shame. The captain's voice filled the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles. We thank you for flying with us and wish you a pleasant stay." His tone was steady, but there was a gravity to it, as though he knew this flight would be remembered far beyond its number and destination. As the seatbelt light chimed off, passengers rose slowly, deliberately. Normally, there would be a rush to grab luggage, a scramble to be first off the plane. But here, hesitation reigned. No one wanted to be the first to move, as though leaving before Marcus did would diminish the moment. Marcus stood calmly, unhurried. He retrieved his briefcase, the initials ME gleaming in the cabin light, and stepped into the aisle. Phones rose instinctively, capturing him from every angle. He could have been a celebrity, a statesman, a hero returning from battle. But he was simply a man who had endured injustice and chosen to reveal truth at the perfect time. Kelly's voice cracked as she finally spoke. "Mr. Ellington, please, I'm sorry." Marcus turned, his expression calm, his voice measured. "Apologies are easy after exposure. What matters is whether you would have acted differently if I had been someone else. A man without this suit, without this briefcase, without these documents. Would you have seen my humanity then?" She faltered, no answer forming on her lips. The silence was answer enough. As passengers began filing out, many paused near Marcus, offering words of respect, apology, or admiration. A man in row 5 shook his hand firmly. "Sir, I judged too quickly. Thank you for showing us all something important today." A woman from row 1 leaned close. "You reminded me that silence is complicity. I won't forget it." Marcus nodded, accepting their words without arrogance. "Remember, it's not about me," he replied. "It's about the dignity we owe each other, without conditions, without assumptions." The young woman in 2B smiled faintly. "You turned a flight into a lesson none of us will forget." Marcus gave her a small nod. Lessons only matter if they change how we act when no one is recording. Outside the plane, the jet bridge connected, and light spilled into the cabin. Marcus stepped forward, his shoes clicking softly against the carpet, his presence steady. Reporters had not yet arrived, but within hours they would. The footage captured by passengers was already racing through social media, destined to spark outrage, debate, and change. In the galley, Kelly slumped against the wall, whispering to another attendant, "He'll have my job. My career is over." The other attendant murmured back, "You did this to yourself. Maybe now you'll see what we all should have seen." The captain approached Marcus as he reached the door. "Mr. Ellington, I'll personally file a full report. But more importantly, I want to apologize, not as captain, but as a man who should have intervened sooner." Marcus regarded him with calm eyes. "Acknowledgement is a start. Action is better. Make sure this never happens again, to anyone." The captain nodded, humbled. Marcus stepped off the plane into the brightness of the terminal. Passengers followed, some still filming, others quietly reflecting. In that moment, Marcus was not just a man, he was a symbol, of resilience, of truth, of transformation. By the time he reached the baggage claim, his phone buzzed with alerts. Messages from colleagues, from reporters, from strangers who had already seen the footage. The story was spreading like wildfire. Airline owner humiliated by his own flight attendant. Headlines would soon dissect every second. Commentators would debate, policies would be rewritten. But for Marcus, the transformation had already happened, not on social media, but in the cabin of Flight 782. Because transformation wasn't about one man revealing his power. It was about an entire group of people, the passengers, witnessing prejudice laid bare, then watching it collapse under the weight of truth. They had been complicit in whispers, and now they were awakened by revelation. That was the real transformation. Marcus stepped off the plane into the brightness of the terminal. Passengers followed, some still filming, others quietly reflecting. In that moment, Marcus was not just a man. He was a symbol of resilience, of truth, of transformation. By the time he reached the baggage claim, his phone buzzed with alerts. Messages from colleagues, from reporters, from strangers who had already seen the footage. The story was spreading like wildfire. Airline owner humiliated by his own flight attendant. Headlines would soon dissect every second. Commentators would debate, policies would be rewritten. But for Marcus, the transformation had already happened, not on social media, but in the cabin of Flight 782. Because transformation wasn't about one man revealing his power. It was about an entire group of people, the passengers witnessing prejudice laid bare, then watching it collapse under the weight of truth. They had been complicit in whispers, and now they were awakened by revelation. That was the real transformation. Marcus paused near the exit, adjusting his briefcase, and addressed a small group of passengers who lingered. "Remember this," he said, his voice low but firm. "Dignity doesn't come from titles, or uniforms, or wealth. It comes from how we treat the person beside us, especially when no one is watching. Don't let whispers decide the story again." They nodded, some with tears in their eyes. Phones captured his words, but more importantly, hearts did. As Marcus walked out into the sunlight, his reflection stretched long across the terminal floor. He wasn't just leaving an airplane, he was leaving a legacy in motion. And for every person who had witnessed that flight, life would never look the same.